What is up, everyone? I've got another Elden Ring build video for you today, and this is a particularly fun one. Over the last several patches, there have been a lot of updates to spells and poise damage, particularly nerfing some of the spells which dealt a lot of poise damage, probably a little bit too much. Well, this build is centered around 2 Ashes of War that still deal a good amount of poise damage so that you can poise break enemies very easily and then get really good critical damage. So let's start with our shopping list. You can pretty much start with this build around the time that you finish Stormveil Castle. The bare minimum things that we need to make this build work are going to be the Misericord, which we pick up in Stormveil Castle, a Guardian Sword Spear, which you can farm for off of the Guardians down on Weeping Peninsula, and then also the 2 Ashes of War. First, Spectral Lance, which you'll put on the Sword Spear. You can grab this at Raya Lucaria Academy. You don't have to beat any of the bosses there. You can just run up to the graveyard and grab this out of it real quick. And then we also want Glintblade Phalanx for our Misericord. You can take this off of Roger's thrusting sword that he gives you after you defeat Godric. And then the other gear that you'll want to pick up, you'll want to grab all 3 dagger talismans. Those are the Cerulean and Crimson daggers, which are going to give you FP and health back when you crit the enemy. And then also the dagger talisman, which will increase our crit damage. Because the main way we're dealing damage is by poise breaking and then getting a critical strike, these 3 talismans are going to be doing work all the time. Your 4th talisman slot can be flexed a bit. I like using the Carrion Filigreed Crest because we're using a lot of weapon skills, and reducing the amount of FP that we're using there tends to be pretty useful. Another one that I played around with a bit was the Ritual Sword Talisman. If you're playing this build right, you should be at full health pretty much all the time because the enemy doesn't get much chance to attack you. You just poise break them, run in, and get a critical strike real quick. And if they don't die, you can just rinse and repeat. We're also going to need a way to cast spells. Early in the game, it doesn't really matter. We're not investing a ton of points into Faith, so we're not getting a ton of spell damage here. Mostly we want to get our Faith up to around 25 so that we can start using Golden Vow. And on occasion, it's useful to use Black Flame Blade. When you buff your weapon with Black Flame Blade, both your Spectral Lance and the blades from the Glintblade Phalanx will apply the debuff, so you can apply the Black Flame debuff from a range. This can be really useful against enemies with high health that you want to maintain a little bit of distance from, whether that's during the entire fight or just during certain phases. You could also do this with the Blood Flame debuff, but because we don't have any other way of applying bleed, it just wasn't a reliable way to get the enemy to hemorrhage, so I don't really use it. It's also worth noting that sometimes I like to buff my weapon with Electrify Armament. I'll use this if I just want to up the raw damage output on my sword spear. Though it is worth noting that this does not increase the damage of your critical strikes, because the critical strikes only take into account the raw damage on the weapon, not what you enchanted it with. And then the 2 other incantations that I like to use are 2 of the Crucible incantations. Those would be the Horns and the Tail. The Horns I use more for a single enemy, and I'll use this if I need a 3rd way to poise break beyond just the Spectral Lance and the Glint Blades. Sometimes if you're facing a fast enemy and they're dodging your weapon arts, they usually don't try to dodge the horns. After some practice, you figure out what distance you need to be from them, charge it up, and if it's a smaller enemy, it'll knock them over, which gives you a good opening to swing away at them. Or if they're a bigger enemy, it can break their poise, letting you get a critical strike. And then the Tail I mostly use in AoE situations when I have multiple enemies to take care of. Because our primary way of dealing with enemies is breaking their poise and then getting a critical strike, that's a one-on-one kind of fight. But when you have to deal with multiple enemies, the Tail does a really good job of either knocking them down or breaking their poise, and you can get a critical strike, then rinse and repeat until they're all dead. As for your armor, it doesn't really matter too much. I ended up going with the Fingerprint armor set and the Bandit mask just because I thought they looked good, and the Fingerprint armor set ends up being a pretty good armor set for the weight. Before I got that far in the game, I was actually wearing mostly the Vulgar Militia set, and I wore the Ash of War scarab on my head to reduce the cost of my weapon skills. But later in the game, I found that that defense debuff was hurting me a lot, so I ended up moving away from that. For your tier, I recommend using the Dexterity Knot Crystal tier and then the Stone Barb Crack tier. On certain boss fights, you're going to need the extra help breaking their stance, and this is where the Stone Barb Crack tier comes in. And most of our damage is coming from our dexterity because we have a keen affinity on both of our weapons. The Guardian Sword Spear is actually one of the best keen scaling weapons in the game. When it's fully upgraded, it gets an A scaling, and with 80 dexterity invested, you get a 785 attack rating with no buffs whatsoever, which is really, really good, especially considering its relatively low stat requirement and its lightweight. The Sword Spear also has a pretty good moveset, and it has a good range. It works well on horseback. It's an all-around really good weapon, and I'm surprised that we're not hearing more people talk about it because I actually thought it was one of the better weapons that I've used. And the last thing you're going to need for this is some sort of a shield. I recommend if you're starting a new game that you go with the Bandit because they'll have a lot of the stats and equipment that you need to start out with, including the Buckler. Early on in the game, the Buckler is going to be the best shield for parrying, but as you progress a little bit more, I recommend you pick up any of the Crest Heater shields. They're pretty lightweight, they mitigate 100% of physical damage, and they don't have a heavy stat requirement, which is important for us because we're not pumping a bunch of points into endurance. You really just need enough endurance to carry your armor and weapons around, which should be anywhere between 14 and 18. You should upgrade to the medium shield once you get access to either Golden Parry or Carrion Retaliation. I ended up using Carrion Retaliation just because it gives a little bit more flexibility. You can actually parry spell projectiles, which doesn't happen too often, but it is nice to have in those situations. In case you're not familiar with parrying, Golden Parry and Carrion Retaliation are a must on a medium shield because the regular parry skill is much harder to land, and the shield is going to be really important for you on certain boss fights. There are certain fights, such as any of the Crucible Knights, Commander Niall, and several others, where they have really high poise and it's hard to break them with your weapon arts, but they're pretty easy to parry. And after testing all my poise break mechanics on Commander Niall for a while, I found out that just landing parries made the fight trivial. Eventually, once you progress far enough to get the Frenzied Flame Seal, you'll use that to replace whatever finger seal you were using. The Frenzied Flame Seal is going to be important because it's the only finger seal that scales off of dexterity, and most of our points are going to be invested into dexterity. So that's where we're going to get most of the scaling for our incantations. Though you will have a few in faith because you need them to meet the minimum requirements to use your spells, which ends up being around 27. I went a few points over that, but you really don't need to go beyond 27 if you don't want to. So now that we have everything we need, we can talk about how this build plays. Early in the game, I recommend you grab the Misericord and Carrion Retaliation as soon as you can. Most light enemies will get staggered just from this weapon art, and then you can run up and get a critical strike on them. Misericord is particularly good at this because it has the highest critical multiplier in the game. And then as you progress into the mid game and even into the late game, Spectral Lance and the Guardian Sword Spear are going to do a really good job at poise breaking most light armored enemies. For any enemies that have slightly higher poise, Glint Blade Phalanx on your Misericord, switch weapons to the Sword Spear, throw a Spectral Lance and run up to him, and the combination of those two will poise break just about any regular enemy in the game. And then in cases where that doesn't work, I like to combo into my Aspects of the Crucible Horns incantation, and this will poise break just about anybody. Or in fights where poise breaking the enemy is a little bit more challenging, that's where I rely on parrying with my shield. There's a lot of different combos you can do with these weapon arts and spells, so I recommend you just play around with them and figure out what works best for you. Another good combo is to combo in the Black Flame Blade with your weapon arts. If you time it right, you should be able to get 3 full applications of Black Flame on the enemy before it runs out, which totals to around 6% of their health. And then if you want to actually swing at your opponent while it's got Black Flame, it will increase your damage by 65% of your incantation scaling. So it can add a little bit of a buff there as well. though I usually don't use it like this. Usually it's just for adding the debuff at a range. If you want the raw damage, I recommend you go with something like Electrify Armament, because that's going to give you a much better damage. If you do end up using Electrify Armament, it's worth noting that it doesn't add any damage to your weapon arts, because it only applies the effect, not the damage. This is an excellent build with a really good toolkit. It's very versatile. The only types of bosses that it really kind of struggles on are really fast, really hard-hitting bosses, such as Malekith. Because bosses like that move so fast, they end up dodging a lot of your weapon arts, which means you're not going to be able to poise break them. And when they move really fast like that, they're much harder to parry. For a stat investment, you'll be shooting for around 40 vigor towards the late mid-game, all the way into the end game. Mind, you really don't need much. You can just leave it at wherever it's at until you reach the late game. When I added a couple points, I got it up to 14, just so that I could cast for longer without needing to pot. Endurance, you just need as many points as you need to carry your weapons and armor. I ended up with 18 at the end. Strength, I just needed 17 to wield the sword spear. Intelligence and arcane, you don't need any. Faith, you need about 27, but you could do a couple points extra if you want a little bit more incantation damage. And then all of your points for damage should be going into dexterity. At level 100, I wound up with around 40 dexterity with my stat spread, which leaves plenty of room for more investment in dexterity as you level up to 150 and beyond. All right, that's the latest. Hope you enjoyed it. I got a couple magic focused builds I'm planning on doing next, so if you like this, stay tuned and you should see those in the next couple weeks.